It was a typical morning in Sunnyside, Queens, and a young woman was getting ready for work. She was about to leave the apartment, and she notices that her roommate, Michelle's, stuff was still there, which is very odd.
They had similar schedules, so for her roommate not to be up and ready to go or have left is very unusual.
I bet if she knew what was on the other side of that door, she never would have opened it.
I got a call that there was a homicide in my command. That we had a female who was found dead in her apartment. They were already starting to limit access to the apartment by the time I got there.
We walked in, it was very kept, very neat. Nothing seemed out of order until you got to the bedroom.
I observed they have marks.
Got a big trauma wound here on the left side of the forehead. Also a burn mark what appears to be
And the most disturbing thing
an iron?
Was the iron burn. So it was very sadistic.
Well, her hands were bound to the headboard with black cord. The amount of violence that was perpetrated on the victim's body was immense. In my career, I've seen many homicide scenes. This one was probably the most gruesome.
I can imagine the amount of pain that she would have had to go through and endure.
As the police were investigating the crime scene, they realized who the person was.
Looks like we got one of our own.
A member of the NYPD crime lab.
The victim was Michelle Lee, a criminalist in the narcotics laboratory. She was 24 years old. For a member of the NYPD, to lose one of your own is devastating.
Anytime there's an attack against law enforcement officers, it's seen as an attack on all of us.
The NYPD is a big family, and when you lose somebody in the family, there is a heightened effort given to solving this kind of case.
Her colleagues, her friends, the people who cared about her, are now the ones that have to piece together her murder.
There's emotions and this personal attachment, but you still have to remain objective.
You make sure you get the headboard and everything behind it also.
And stay focused on what your task is to try and find out what happened.
They went through the scene with a fine-toothed comb, knowing that the smallest detail could solve this case.
The crime scene unit, they took everything. They took the contents of the garbage can. They took everything that they could that can help them try and uncover who was in that room right before Michelle Lee was murdered.
At this crime scene, there were a few things that really stood out to investigators.
You have a burn mark that appears to be inflicted by something similar to an iron. We have an iron at the scene, so now we have something that's handled by the perpetrator. We have a knife that's left behind that's in the victim, something else that's handled by the perpetrator. Because Michelle was naked, we might have a sexual element involved in this scene.
But the crime scene was devoid of any blood splatter. There was no cast-off, and that was very weird. The whole crime scene was puzzling. We needed to discover who did this and ultimately prove it.
The evidence was being sent back to the crime lab. At the New York Post, we knew something major was happening.
The New York Post has a police bureau at police headquarters, and they're monitoring breaking news alerts, they're monitoring the police scanner. They'd heard about a DOA in Sunnyside, Queens, but that's not what the New York Post is going to put on our front page. We needed the real story.
When the reporter arrived, she got details about the age of the victim, the name of the victim, how the body was found. The victim's roommate had been away for the weekend, and she didn't come back until Sunday night.
And she went to bed, and when she woke up is when she realized she had been asleep all night long with her roommate brutally murdered in the room next door to her. As soon as they learned that it was a member of the NYPD and the gruesome nature of the crime, the Post knew that this was going to be a big one.
And meanwhile, at the precinct, as investigators were looking further into the case, they started to consider whether Michelle's job could have been her undoing.
Michelle was a criminalist in the Controlled Substance Analysis section of the NYPD's Forensic Investigations Division. Her job was to analyze large quantities of narcotics.
And as a crime tech, your name is going on very important documents that end up convicting some really messed up people.
Investigators looked at her case files, and it was discovered that she actually did work on big cases involving dangerous, violent drug offenders.
These two guys had a violent past. That Mendez case, you remember that? She testified, so that's definitely a suspect.
Was it a criminal defendant who had something against her? Or had she testified at trial against somebody that had a vendetta, that wanted revenge?
One of the people that Michelle was involved in convicting could have figured out where she lived through public records.
Somebody who's incarcerated can make a phone call and have a friend or an associate kill someone that they had a grudge against.
The question was, did Michelle pay the ultimate price for just doing her job? Could these drug dealers have gotten to one of our own?
There was no forced entry.
Members of the 108 Detective Squad all worked tirelessly to solve the murder of Michelle Lee.
Detectives started to consider that her murder was related to her work in the NYPD crime lab.
Let's get them down. Let's pull their records. Compare them to any of the files that might be familiar.
Was it a criminal defendant who had something against her? Had she testified at trial against somebody that had a vendetta, that wanted revenge?
Brutality of it, man, that's not normal, you know?
It looked like somebody really wanted to make Michelle suffer. She had a burn mark, she had a knife sticking out of her neck. It was clear that she had been tortured.
Leaders of drug organizations commit these types of crimes. It's not enough in those cases to just kill someone. They want to inflict the most violence possible.
Some of these drug organizations have very specific ways of inflicting pain, almost like a calling card. So they needed to take a closer look at her wounds. And something struck police as a bit odd.
One would expect that the ligature would leave markings on her wrist, but no such markers were found.
Which shows that she wasn't tied up while she was still alive.
What investigators had determined about Michelle's wounds is that a lot of them were inflicted after she was dead, which raised red flags because you can't torture somebody after they're gone.
So the whole brutality of this scene where it looked like retaliation against her as being a member of the New York City Police Department, that theory gets thrown out the window.
Investigators didn't know if this was like a psychopath, like a sexual deviant. Was it for their own gratification? Or was it to throw off the investigators so we wouldn't be able to understand why and who did this?
All we knew was the cops needed to get this man off the street as soon as possible.
So at that point, investigators needed to speak to the people that were closest to Michelle in life, her family.
We needed to figure out what was going on in Michelle's life at that time. Trying to figure out what the motivation was for this homicide.
Michelle's family is from Korea. She had a big family. They were really close.
We learned that she had lived with her parents, but ultimately she wanted to be more independent, and that's why she moved to Sunnyside. Michelle struggled with wanting to move out because she didn't want to leave her parents.
There she is. Oh my goodness. This is so nice.
But ultimately she wanted to be independent and she wanted to start her life.
What is this? Oh, no. Yeah, of course I remember that. This doesn't look like a forensic.
Michelle always dreamed of being a forensic scientist. She was probably a kid who grew up watching CSI, and she wanted to go to John Jay College of Criminal Justice.
She proved talented even in college, and she was hired right after she graduated John Jay.
She had become a member of the Forensic Investigations Division in the NYPD, which is a very big deal.
She got the dream job.
She was an extremely talented scientist. She was one of the true talents in that lab prior to her life being taken. In talking to the family, they had no idea who would do this, why anyone would do this. Their daughter that they loved and cherished was taken from them for no apparent reason and in the most cruel way. And they were devastated. It was hard. It was hard. It was a lot of grief. Well, you can't help but feel for the family, but you have to really focus on what your job is and what you need to do to help them ultimately get justice for what happened to their loved one.
Back at the precinct, investigators began to hone in on the crime scene. The fact that she was found completely nude and tied up on the bed suggested that it could have been related to her love life.
The most intimate partner can hurt you in the most intimate ways. And the person that you least suspect that would do this to you is most often the person who's closest to you.
So Detectives needed to know who she dated, old flings, anybody she had bad relationships with, and luckily, there was a key piece of evidence.
It's a diary.
Michelle's diary, it was found at the crime scene. A diary was going to tell investigators things that the victim wouldn't tell her friends or her families.
When we went through her diary, the same name kept popping up again and again and again.
Gary. Who's Gary?
I don't know. We don't have anything on him yet.
It was Gary McGurk. It was entry after entry talking about her relationship with Gary.
Investigators learned Michelle met Gary when she was a student at John Jay College for Criminal Justice. And immediately they just hit it off.
They just were right. They both were interested in forensics. They had a lot in common.
She just fell madly for this very handsome guy. He was a soccer player for the school. He came from Ireland and had this really attractive Irish brogue. It was just this really intense passion.
And it looked like this relationship could turn into something very serious.
She wrote about her affection for him in her journal. She wrote about how much she loved him, how she wanted to tell him that she loved him and couldn't find the right way to do it.
She really wanted to be his girlfriend.
But that is when Gary started pulling back.
The problem in relationships in general is that they often don't survive.
He just wasn't ready for that level of commitment. He wasn't ready to settle down. He was this young guy. He was 23 at the time, and he just wasn't in the same place.
Michelle's heartbroken.
According to her journal, it seemed like Michelle was willing to do whatever she could to keep Gary in her life.
They kept seeing each other. They had what you would call a friends with benefits relationship.
Michelle really wanted to make Gary hers, and it was clear that there was a lot of passion coming from one side. And whenever there's a lot of passion involved in a relationship and it's unrequited, bad things can happen.
Ultimately, Michelle's fairy tale did not have a happy ending.
When we looked into Michelle's diary, it was entry after entry talking about her relationship with Gary McGurk. We certainly knew from Michelle's own words that she cared very deeply for him.
Seemed like they had some kind of dating relationship. See if we can find this guy in the system.
Yeah, let's see if we can get him in.
So detectives talked to Gary McGurk on the phone and invited him in.
Hey, how you doing? Good. Thanks for coming out, man.
Gary was cooperative with the detectives. He spoke to them willingly.
So we just wanted to ask you a few questions, man, just protocol.
They asked him about his relationship with Michelle and why they broke up. Gary said that they started dating, but that they just didn't click as a couple.
We were still involved in each other's lives. I still consider her a really great friend.
But as the interview progressed, it became clear that Gary McGurk had a very complicated relationship with Michelle Lee. Gary labeled their relationship as one that was taboo or risque. He mentioned acts that they would do. He mentioned strangulation and violence towards each other.
Choking, bondage, things that probably detectives looked at it as not as ordinary in certain aspects.
It was surprising for the police to hear these details, given what they knew about Michelle.
Everything that they have heard about from Michelle is that she's this young woman who's hardworking, college educated, and now they're hearing a different side of her.
Gary was being very upfront. He was disclosing really personal information that wasn't necessarily the most flattering details about Michelle's life. But at the same time, he seemed to genuinely care for her and want the case to get solved. And one of the reasons is because he credited her with having saved his life.
Can you tell us anything else?
Actually, yeah. She had been helping me out with some payments.
Gary told police that he had actually had stage 4 cancer, but he didn't have American health insurance, so he had to pay out of pocket for all of his cancer expenses.
It's cancer? Is that weird?
And Michelle had lent him money to help with the cancer treatment. Gary's totally distraught. He's clearly somebody who knew Michelle pretty well, and he's like, you know, we were so close, and he's a typical grieving friend.
I'm more than happy to help with anything, just so we can get to the bottom of it.
Gotcha.
There was no evidence that told us that Gary was the one responsible here.
And based on Gary's statements, it didn't appear he had a motive to do this.
What are your whereabouts? What were you doing the day of the murder?
So they asked Gary where he was on the night of the 26th, and Gary said he's got a new girlfriend, and he said he was with her on the night that this happened to Michelle.
Oh, can we get in contact?
Yeah, I can get to my phone here.
So we talked with his girlfriend, and she corroborated that she was with him or that night. I moved to homicide.
Gary said that he even received a phone call from Michelle that night, but he was asleep and didn't pick it up.
Because he showed him his phone and said, I got a missed call from her around, 4 o'clock in the morning.
Take it with the phone.
There was a missed call that lasted about 20 seconds.
So police asked Gary who else could have done this to her.
And according to Gary, she said that she had somebody over.
And Michelle Lee had another man in the apartment that night. We needed to identify who that person was.
Hey, we appreciate you coming down in the office. Thank you for the information.
Yeah, of course.
All right.
The fact that he described these rough sex acts and then remembered what they have at the crime scene, he's actually laying out for them a different scenario where the type of activity that she was involved with could have led to her demise with somebody else.
It definitely looked like a bizarre sexual scene to me. Like a sadistic sex act that had gone bad.
This could have been a consensual tryst that went too far, and the perpetrator tried to cover his tracks. Either that, or whoever did this was just a really twisted, sick, depraved person.
This story, it sounded eerily familiar to police.
Robert Chambers, described as a handsome, affluent 19-year-old preppy, now faces murder charges. He's accused of strangling 18-year-old Jennifer Levin to death in Central Park Tuesday morning.
The preppy killer in 1986, Robert Chambers, had been involved with the murder of the beautiful Jennifer Levin.
Defense called Levin's character into question by claiming she died accidentally from consensual rough sex.
He had claimed that they were having rough sex and it got out of hand.
I didn't mean to hurt her. I liked her very much.
So Robert Chambers said that Jennifer Levin had asked him to choke her, and that's why she died.
So cops decided to retrace Michelle's footsteps from that night, see where she went, see what happened.
Did she have a new man in her life? Did she bring somebody home?
It was discovered that she was visiting her parents that day. She went to the drugstore, and she went to the gym, and then we all had an idea.
So detectives decided to search surveillance cameras at the stores and the businesses near Michelle's residence to determine, could they see Michelle? Was she being followed? When was the last time she left her house? The video cameras are a wealth of information.
The NYPD detectives spent the whole weekend just hours and hours looking at that video surveillance. But they did finally see something by that CVS in Sunnyside that caught their attention. Something that would ultimately lead to finding the killer. The NYPD detectives spent hours and hours looking at video surveillance, and they did finally see an image that looked like Michelle Lee meeting up with someone on the corner by that CVS in Sunnyside and walking back towards her apartment. The video surveillance footage was not that clear. You couldn't see a face. You saw basically an outline. It looked like a man, but we couldn't tell what they were talking about. The investigators didn't know if this was someone she had just met or someone she had a long-term relationship with.
This was big. So they needed to find out who the person was and talk to him.
Cops looked at guys that she might have encountered at the gym, guys she might have encountered at her neighborhood.
Let's get him down.
Friends, family, anybody who she had just met or was interested in. They were interviewed and they were asked, where were they? Had they talked to her recently? Were they in her apartment? So everybody was scrutinized.
It's personal. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a robbery. This was intentional. Definitely.
But ultimately, their alibis were confirmed, and they were cleared.
Detectives needed something more. With no one behind bars for Michelle's murder, the people who lived in Michelle's Queens neighborhood of Sunnyside were really terrified about this case.
Reporters from the Post went to the neighborhood that Michelle lived in, and the neighbors were totally freaked out. One person told the Post that they were planning on installing bars on their windows, but left the neighborhood extremely shaken up.
No one knew if it was a stranger that scooped her off the street when it did all these terrible things to her.
The community just really wanted answers.
There was a lot of pressure to solve this and get this person off the street.
The New York City detectives were working nonstop.
And the CSI community certainly wasn't taking Michelle's death lightly either.
It was very traumatic to the people that worked at the lab. The NYPD has a long history of dealing with loss. It's tragic every time. It's hard every time.
This marks the 7th NYPD officer killed in 5 years.
A tragic reminder today of the dangers police officers face every day all around the country.
Tragedies like this are not only an affront to the men and women in blue, but to all the people our cops proudly serve.
But civilians that work in a crime lab have no context, have no history, and have no way of dealing with this type of loss. So it's very tragic.
It was a very somber feeling. Within the whole laboratory, we could feel it. Where the crime scene unit works, where my unit was, you can see a sadness in your interaction with your coworkers and other people in the building.
This is what law enforcement is about. It's about family. It's about brotherhood, sisterhood.
Ultimately, they wanted to do their jobs and get justice for Michelle Lee.
So detectives, they start to think, who else could have done this? Was it some other guy in her life? Anyone else that might have come across her that would have done this to her?
And that's when police got a big break in the case.
So a few days later, detectives get results back from the forensic testing.
When the garbage in Michelle's bathroom was tested, there was a tissue containing semen.
That piece of evidence, that tissue was the keystone of this investigation.
And what they found totally changed everything.
DNA was found on several tissues in Michelle Lee's garbage can. And those tissues were found on top of receipts that were dated April 25th, the day of Michelle Lee's murder.
And they realized who the person was.
It was Gary McGurk's semen on these tissues. There would be no explanation as to why his DNA would be on those tissues on top of a receipt that was dated April 25th if he had never been in that apartment on the day Michelle Lee was murdered. We had an exact date and time that Gary was there. That was the aha moment of this case. So the totality of all the evidence started to be damning. It was a house of bricks being built.
And at that point, cops pull cell phone records for Gary and for Michelle.
Hey, Tatum, check this out.
During his statement, Gary McGurk said that he had received a call from Michelle at 4:30.
You know what? I actually got a call from her that night.
He was insistent that the detective look at his phone.
Just check the phone. I'm telling you, it'll clear everything up.
Look. Michelle called me. She called me at 4:30.
He said that he was at home when he received the phone call. But according to the science behind it, there's no way that happens.
The phone records showed to us that Gary's phone was pinging off of the closest cell tower in the vicinity of Michelle's apartment. And there's a cell phone tower every other block. So if he was where he said he was, then his phone would have been pinging a long ways away from Michelle's apartment. But it wasn't. It was right there.
That was an indication that the phones were together. And Gary McGurk was trying to throw the investigators off.
Now detectives know they got him.
And it wasn't a moment too soon.
Cops went to Gary's house in Queens, and they actually catch him leaving the home with a bag and a passport.
I want to talk to you today about a few new developments in the case.
When Gary was questioned by the investigators, his story was ever morphing to try and outsmart the next question. So he saw the video surveillance equipment that we had. That's when he told us, you're going to see me meeting with her when you look at that video surveillance. He was trying to think ahead. And you notice that timeline that he was giving starting to shift. He changed from not being in the area and talking to Michelle to being in the area and being with Michelle.
Okay, yeah, okay, look.
Finally, cops had this evidence against him, and he told police, okay, yes, this happened, but it was an accident. Michelle was into kinky sex. You know, she liked to be choked, she liked to be tied up, and, you know, things kind of went wrong because she had wanted to do this stuff. So he starts to put the blame on her.
It was the exact same defense plea as Robert Chambers, the man that we had dubbed the Preppy Killer.
After a lengthy deliberation by jurors, concerned prosecutors agreed to let Chambers plead guilty to manslaughter.
The rough sex defense contributed to him getting off with manslaughter charge and a lesser sentence.
If convicted of murder, Chambers faced life in prison. Now he will serve a minimum of 5 years.
This is not the first time that a man had tried to use some kind of kinky sex defense to get out of a murder.
This was an elaborate cover-up. And while Gary lied and kept on lying, the evidence didn't.
It was determined by the medical examiner that the cause of death was blunt force trauma to Michelle's head. And all of the other injuries that were done to her body was post-mortem after she died.
So obviously you're going to be able to tell that it wasn't choking that led to her death. It was a hammer.
Like the saying goes, right? Oh, what a tangled web we weave. And he had spun himself such a web that he couldn't even get out of it.
What we have is a person who's certainly not in his right mind trying to cover up a crime by making it look like it's perpetrated by a person who's not in his right mind.
That didn't stop investigators from getting to the truth.
Tell us what happened.
Including the most disturbing part of his lies.
How are you having treatment? Who were treated?
They found out that he actually never did have cancer, and he'd been lying all along.
Tell us about your cancer. What are you guys? We're in New York's own now. They ain't gonna be lying on you. So if I was you, I'll cooperate as much as possible.
The whole thing was a ruse just to get money out of Michelle.
Gary used the fact that Michelle was a good person against her.
It's early, big.
He knew how much in love she was with him. And ultimately, that's what led to her death.
This guy's a sick bastard. Totally taking advantage of the girl who really loved him.
On June 16, 2010, Gary pled guilty to the manslaughter of Michelle Lee.
We're happy that an arrest is made in this case. Obviously, it had a very traumatic effect inside the police department.
Gary had a very frail ego. He tried to keep up the story that it was all just an accident. But eventually, the truth came out.
Gary told us during his sentencing that he went into the apartment and they had been intimate.
Perhaps she figured out that Gary was scamming her,
Are you serious?
that he didn't actually have cancer.
I thought you were gonna die.
She'd given him all this money for no reason
Oh my God, you're crazy. I'm not crazy.
and threatened to report him to the police, which is where she worked.
Corey, move. Get out of the way. Get out.
And he just snapped.
Gary said that while she was passed out, he wrapped her head in plastic wrap to contain the crime scene, and he hit her in the head.
He tied her hands and wrists to the bedpost with a cell phone cord. And that he used an iron to make burn marks on her abdomen and chest, and stabbed her in the neck staged a crime scene to throw investigators off.
And then he took the plastic with him. He took the hammer that he used. He admitted that he took her cell phone. And he admitted to placing the calls after he killed her in an effort to make it look like she was still alive. He admitted all of these things to the judge.
Well, he's a student of forensic psychology. So he probably read somewhere in his books about staged crime scenes, and he thought that he was going to outsmart the detectives.
People like Gary McGurk are narcissistic. They create an image that they want everybody to see, and somebody who sees through that image is a threat to them. Forensics is about finding the truth, and we were able to find the truth in this case.
One of the worst parts about this case is that Gary blamed her, or at least tried to blame her for her own murder.
We don't know if Michelle really liked to be choked or tied up. That was something that Gary created to defame her character when she wasn't alive and able to defend herself. The dead can't speak. He wanted the cops to think that Michelle had brought this upon herself.
And I'm sure the detectives smiled at him and said, well, not today.
Gary really tried to strip Michelle of her dignity. But Michelle's friends and colleagues at the NYPD didn't allow that to happen.
It's a tragedy when you lose a brilliant mind, and there's no telling what her contributions to the criminal justice system could have been.
Michelle is still part of the family, the police family. And we don't forget that kind of stuff.
She will never get married. She will never have a child. She will never have a life. And that's because of what Gary did. She was a bright star that just was extinguished way too early.